Hello and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host, and today's guest is here to help you find your way if you're feeling lost, stuck, or afraid as you move towards your new future after divorce. So I want to welcome my guest today, Shannon McGorry.
Thank you so much for having me, Susan. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I am so excited to have you. For people who follow My Divorce in a Better Way, you provided a wonderful blog post a few months ago that we got a great response to. And I really think that this topic, this is the reason I did the Divorce and Beyond podcast, because yes, I want people to get tools about moving through divorce, but I have found over and over again that it's really facing the future and somewhat feeling paralyzed about the fact that people don't know what that future holds. I really wanted it to be divorce and beyond. So I love that you're here. I want to give people a little of your background so that they know. I always want people to know who they're getting the information from. So Shannon is a certified professional coach, and she specializes in divorce and life empowerment. Expertise, prioritization, clarity, and accountability, that's a good one, are the principles of her practice, and she empowers her clients to show up confident, well-informed, and educated as they make decisions and take consistent, intentional action in support of their future reality. So I think you're all hearing how this ties into our theme for the day. Shannon has guested, she's been a guest on with our friends at Worthy on their podcast, Divorce and Other Things You Can Handle. She's written for Thrive Global, Divorce Magazine, Divorce Girl Smiling, Jackie Philosoph, who's going to be a guest on this show soon, Your Biggest Vision podcast, and the Healthy Divorce podcast. And she's available for private coaching, workshops, and speaking engagements via her website, which is lovestrengthandgrace.com. So Shannon, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I mentioned it in the intro here that it's a common phenomena, and I think this is how you've probably found your niche, is that, people in marriages that are not going well or are failing. One of the things that keeps them stuck in the marriage can be the fear of the future, because, when you're in a marriage, even if it's not a future that you're looking forward to, at least you know what it looks like.
Right.
And when you finally pull the trigger and decide it's time to move on, now all of a sudden that future's kind of a big black hole.
Mm-hmm.
And if for however long you've been with your spouse, you thought future was one thing. Now you don't know what it's going to be. So I think the fact that you're helping people at a time when they have the biggest opportunity to redefine their future. I always say, and my listeners will have heard this, divorce is an opportunity.
Yeah.
Because
100%.
now you have almost a blank slate. I mean, certainly you have things that hold you, in place, your children, your job,
Right.
things like that. But, I think let's just start with, I've always found that people in this space have some story of their own that brought them to an understanding. And I think you do as well. So maybe we could start with your backstory, because that always gives people, the listeners, something to relate to.
Sure. So I obviously went through my own divorce, and in that process worked with a therapist who was phenomenal. And I had a lot of fear at the time, and I was stuck in processing the divorce and stuck in that place of, this is going to be my reality. And what I found was, through my own journey, divorce does not have to define us. We get to choose how we're going to live the rest of this chapter and what's next. And that's why I love the title of your podcast, because it really is about the beyond. It's about what's next. But in my own personal journey, I had a lot of fear. And my therapist and I was, worried and anxious and overwhelmed and sad and just completely stuck. And I remember my therapist said to me, Shannon, don't stay an ugly too long. It's not who you are, but it's who you could become. And for me, that was the moment my choice became crystal clear. I could stay stuck in the past and in this place of fear, or I could intentionally choose to accept the reality and start to make choices to build my future based on what I valued, what was important to me, and how I ultimately wanted to live and who I ultimately wanted to be. So I used that as my personal experience and relating it to other individuals who are going through divorce, because that fear is so prevalent, Susan. And fear shows up for three basic reasons. It's the fear of the loss, it's the fear of the process, and it's the fear of the outcome or the unknown. And divorce ignites all three of those categories.
Oh, yes. Oh,
And
yes.
so it's, how do we process that fear? How do we take intentional action despite that fear? Because the other choice is we're going to be in exactly the same place days, weeks, months, years from now. And that's not what any of us really want.
No, and it so resonates with me what you're saying. My very first episode of the Divorce and Beyond podcast was with Susan Sandler, and it's called Punch Fear in the Face.
Mm-hmm.
And, I wanted to start this podcast with that episode because, as you say, fear is the predominant emotion that people feel in the divorce process. And it's great that you break it down into those three aspects of fear, because I believe 100% correct. It's the, fear of losing what you have, fear of the process, and fear of the future. So, and I think you identified in what you just said there, something that Susan also said, that the way to punch fear in the face, or the way to fight fear, is taking action.
Yeah, we've got to shine light on those darkest places, because when we do, we give more power to our action and less power to that fear. And when we do that, we're taking action by speaking to professionals, by getting support, by acquiring the knowledge that gives us that power to make decisions, to make choices, to take action. And that fear then is lessened.
Yeah. And I think that's powerful for people to hear, because the thing that I personally experienced with fear, and fear comes about, anytime we're facing the unknown. I think uncertainty is not one of those places that we as humans relish in wallowing in, right? We do not like uncertainty. And I do think that's one of the reasons why people stay in marriages that aren't going well, is they would prefer to be in a situation they know,
Right.
even if it's not the one that's fulfilling them, rather than face the unknown.
Yes.
But for me, it's doing the simplest of things to move forward, even if it's just making a list or doing something. So, I'm wondering, when people come to you, how do you get them started with sort of defining or taking that action? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so we're really working with two parallel tracks here. We're processing those thoughts and those feelings and those emotions that they're having, because it is so important to do that. We cannot brush that stuff under the carpet. However, the beauty of coaching is dealing with the now and the what's next. So we're processing the now and we're focused on what's next. And what I firmly believe is of critical importance is our habits and our values. So similar to what you just said, it's the specific, repeatable things we do that create the biggest change in our life. And those are our habits. The second piece is our values, digging into what's really important to us. And I think of it as like the layers of an onion, because we start out as individuals, maybe we're working, and then we get married, and maybe we change our professional role, or we change our family dynamic, and we make concessions because that's what we do as a partner. That's what we do in a family, is we love and support those that we care about. Over time, sometimes that erodes our individual power, because we kind of get a little bit watered down. We've layered on all these other pieces to ourselves. And when a dramatic life event like divorce happens, some of us are left standing. I personally was in this category of, who am I? And what do I want? What would I even choose? And so to get back in touch with my values, get back in touch with our values, helps us chart that course to understand what is important to us. What are those things in life that we really have to have or want to experience? And then once we can identify those, how do we take our habits and build those so that we're living out those values each and every day?
It brings to mind, I don't know, have you seen the book Atomic Habits by James Clear?
I
It's on
have.
the, so I just finished reading it, and so what you're saying just really sparks so much of what I read in there that struck me, because he was talking about, and one of the things that I thought was really impactful was that goals are one thing, but it's actually the small daily habits that get us to our goals that are the important part. Because goals, once you achieve them, are just goals that have been achieved. But
Right.
it's the habits that help us to achieve our goals, and establishing those habits, creating new ones, that is so important for moving us forward. And for people going through divorce, I know when I've interviewed other people like Jen Giamo, when I interviewed her,
Mhm.
she literally said, and this is, if you've ever met Jen, she's the most active, energetic, she's a fitness trainer to the stars. But she said when she was going through a divorce, she couldn't even get out of bed some days. Like, she literally had to, because she had a dog, she had to force herself to get out of bed to take him for a walk.
Yeah.
And, I think that is where some people find themselves when you're talking about the now and
Yeah.
getting through the now. So, do you build out, as you're working with your clients and you find people maybe not in that extreme a case or in that extreme a case, how do you help them to, do you set the goal first and then come up with the habits, or do you look to the habits and then that leads to the goal?
So it's not even so much the goal as it is the values. We're identifying what our values are. And that leads us to taking action in the sense that, okay, if one of my values is my faith, then what habits am I putting in place to live that out? If one of my values is being very healthy, mind, body, and soul, then what are my habits that I have in place on a daily, weekly, monthly basis that have me living out that value? So we first identify the values, and some people have 5, some people have 10, but we list them all out and then we're ranking them in priority order. And if you have 5, all 5 of them can be a 10 for you. That's no problem. It's a really individualized approach. And listen, our values change as we go through life. We have different chapters of life where maybe for this 3-month period, my physical fitness is much more of a value of mine. I'm giving it more priority, more time, more energy because I let it slack for a little bit. So we're constantly changing and moving those values, but we do all kind of have this core set that we have on our horizon and in our vision constantly. Um, and then we're taking those habits, and those are like we said, those small specific actions we're taking that are bolstering those values up. And what we need to be careful of through divorce, because we can get stuck in sadness or in anger. And what I find with most clients is that's ultimately not who they are. They don't want to be a bitter individual. They don't want to harbor this resentment. They don't want to be living in overwhelming fear. So we have to be careful that those habits we're using during divorce and right after don't become the stakehold and the foundation of who we are, because that won't support ultimately our long-term values.
Right. That's a great point, because, in that moment of divorce, and it really is that it's a moment. And
Mhm.
that's something that I always have worked, as a divorce attorney with clients to help them to try and understand, because it's so overwhelming in the moment, the process,
Yeah,
that people start to feel like this is the only thing in their life.
right.
And they become so immersed in it that even when the divorce is over, they stay immersed in the divorce
Yeah.
and they're unable to move forward. So this exercise that you're talking about of identifying your values, one, you said earlier, and I think it's also a good point, many people lose sight of those values, or they've been
Mhm.
modified in the partnership or in the
Yeah.
marriage, to a point where they become unrecognizable to us. So getting
Yeah.
back in touch with that and what your values are and what is actually important to you. You're right, it might have changed. You might have children now. You might need to get back out into the workforce. You might need to figure out how to run a household all on your own, or
Right.
if you're the breadwinner, how you're going to, manage your finances to support 2 households, or whatever that might be.
Right.
But the exercise of defining your values is kind of a very high level first step. And I think it's important for people to realize that. So I love that's a part of your process. Um,
Absolutely. A foundational one.
yeah, and working with people. So from knowing what your values are, how do you help people to then plot their future forward?
hmm So we also look at our categories of life. So we have our professional lives, we have our emotional lives, we have our social lives, we have our spiritual lives, we have our physical lives. We're looking at these pillars or categories, and we're seeing how satisfied are you in each and every one of these, and getting real with that, and being okay with, out of a 1 to 10 category, 10 being completely satisfied. I'm not at all satisfied socially right now, because divorce affects our social life. Some of
Oh,
our joint friends, some of our neighbors, some of our family, it gets messy very quickly. And so we have to re-identify ourselves in some of those places and recreate what is fulfilling, what is important. How do we want to spend our time? Maybe we have, every other weekend without our kids now if we have children. Well, what does that look like? If the house is empty and quiet, are we taking advantage of that as a means of self-care? Or do we want to be out and about with other people making plans? So how are we utilizing that time, energy, resource to better you, to move your process forward rather than getting stuck? So, in identifying those categories of life and where we're satisfied and where we're not, it can become very apparent where we want to give the resource of time and energy and thought, and developing mindset around that and actions that feel right to each individual. Some people want to start dating right away. Some people absolutely want to spend time on themselves because they don't want to repeat the same mistakes. And they do want to peel back that onion and realize, like, okay, now that I do have this freedom or this time or this new dynamic, who am I and what am I doing with that? So again, similar to the values exercise, this categories of life exercise is very helpful in pausing instead of going through the motions because this is what I've always done or this is what I need to do. Divorce creates this where we hit this pause button and we can start to be very intentional with what we're thinking, what we're doing, and why. Why are we doing this? What ultimately are we looking to get out of it versus going through these motions, especially right after divorce, where we've had this chaotic, stream of events that have demanded so much time and energy from us. I say to my clients all the time, going through divorce is like being a Super Bowl athlete or a rock star on tour. The energy that is required of us is incredible. And so scientifically, it's proven that the stress we put our body through needs to equal the recovery that we give our body. And I mean, if we all did that after divorce, we'd all be in Tahiti for a couple of years. So let's scale it back, but recognize that it's still very important to turn inward a little bit and figure out who we are and take a deep breath and kind of give ourselves that time and grace to reset, redefine, and chart what's next.
yeah. And I think it's important. You said something there, as you're defining these categories and these roles for your future, knowing these things as you're going through your divorce and you are negotiating your divorce settlement, to use the example that you said, having every other weekend where your kids are with your co-parent, or knowing that perhaps you want to advance your career and that means going back and getting recertified or going and getting some more education. Those are things that you then can take into consideration as you're negotiating your settlement,
Absolutely.
because you put the time in and the effort to identify those things. So it's an extremely valuable exercise during the process of divorce, not to be done. I mean, you can do it after the divorce is finalized, but then you may find that aspects of your settlement don't line up with your post
Right.
divorce plans. So
Yep.
you work with clients during the process as well, and I just want them to understand how valuable that exercise can be for them,
Mm-hmm.
because that overwhelm that you discussed, also my experience is many people just go on coast or
Oh, yeah.
autopilot during the divorce and sort of let it happen to them. They accept, well, that's what the norm is, so that's what I'm going to accept in my settlement, or that's what's, someone says is fair, so that's what I'll do, without looking to see if it suits their new future.
Right. And I think it all goes back to the fear of the process. Is it going to be too uncomfortable if I push back? Is it going to be too hard to ask these questions? And so when we can show up empowered and with a sense of courage and confidence for ourselves and for creating the life that we ultimately want to live, we're very well served.
Yeah, so you use the word empowered, and I want to go to that for a minute, because a lot of people, if people have listened to this podcast, they hear that word a lot. Empowered, empowered, empowered. And that's because it is a very important part of this divorce process. So many people are feeling powerless,
yes,
that becoming empowered so they can show up for the process is important. But how do you actually, one, define empowerment, and how do you help people get there?
Sure. So I think you make a great point about feeling powerless. And so for me, it comes down to the fact that our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions are like dominoes. What we think creates how we feel. And based on how we feel, we're taking action. So we need to make sure that in this time when you're making decisions and facing realities, making choices that are creating your future, you're showing up from a very strong mindset, with a very strong mindset, from a place of courage. And that's what I mean by empowered, that you have the backing of knowing who you are and what you want to get from this process so you can live your life on the other side. And that takes a team of professional support. I liken it to if you had a cancer diagnosis, you wouldn't just go in with your general practitioner. You'd have a surgeon, you'd have an oncologist, you'd have a nursing staff, you'd have supportive family and friends at home. And it's like this piece of a puzzle. We all work together to make this the healthiest outcome for all parties involved. So we need to show up empowered. And that's what I mean by that. This holistic view of how are we taking care of this client, this individual, mind, body, and soul, strengthening their mindset so that as they go through this process, they're serving themselves and those they love very well. So it's about framing this in a way that people can accept the reality. I work with a lot of individuals who chose the divorce. I work with a lot of individuals who are completely shocked that this is their reality. And so you have both ends of this spectrum, but it comes down to a choice. The choice may not be yours about why the divorce happened or that the divorce is happening in general. But how we handle it from this moment forward, every one of those choices is ours. So who are we showing up to be? And I gotta say, when we can take the high road, we have a lot less regret. We have a much better outcome. We have more peace inside, a lot less stress. And so working slowly over time, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. We're processing where you are and we're moving yourself forward on that path. And when we can make that concept of choice, keep bringing that back into the process. And there's resistance there. I have clients who'll say, well, I didn't choose this. Like, I now have to deal with this outcome. I can't make her stay, or I can't make him change his mind. That is true. That choice has been made. But now this choice, how you're going into the meeting with your attorney, how you're showing up for mediation, what you're doing on the weekend that he or she has the children, those are your choices. Do you want to go down this path of resentment, or do you want to start to work on the acceptance so that you are healthier mind, body, and soul?
And that's really, I wish I had a mic, or I could drop my mic, because I think it would make a very loud noise here that people don't want to hear, but that's a mic drop, people. I really think that is such a big concept if people can understand it. That, because I hear that, obviously I hear that too. I have people, especially when I was representing people in divorce, who would come in and say, I don't want a divorce. How do I stop this? And their energy would be focused on something that frankly is an impossibility. If one person, we're a no fault country. If one person wants a divorce, the divorce will happen. But what you just said, The choice is for you on how you're going to move forward. And that is, the difference. I'm calling this episode Building a Heartful Life After Heartbreak. That's the key to having a heartful life. That
Right.
is that this is all your choice. And from that realization, even if you didn't want those choices, they are your choices. And when you take control and you start making them, that's where empowerment comes from.
Mhm.
That's where you show up for not just the process of divorce, but also for creating your new future.
Right. Who you are going to be ultimately on the other side. And I get it. I mean, I've stood in that chapter of resentment and hurt and how is this my life? And I think that's what helps me relate to clients so well is I understand, but I can show you what's possible and I can provide you the tools of hope to show that it doesn't have to define you. It doesn't have to be like this. And how do we move forward?
Yeah. And I think, one thing I hear from listeners all the time, I actually just got an email this morning from a listener who said that she enjoys watching the video version of the podcasts because she loves to see me and the guests because it gives her hope. Because
Mm.
she's like, you've been through it, Susan. Most of your guests have been through it. And I see all of you talking about how you got through the process, how I mean, my entire life was redefined by the time of my divorce. My divorce was quite a long time ago at this point, 1991, I think. It was a long time ago. But I went from one lifestyle, one life to a completely different world.
Yeah.
And then other changes in life have completely changed my life again. And when people like you will come on and talk about that, I think there's hope for those who are listening who are in the midst of that process and are feeling hopeless.
Yeah, because it's not easy work. I'm not going to kid you. It's hard work. It's some of the hardest work I've ever done myself, and it's a very difficult space to stand in and hold for clients because it is some of our darkest places. But I will tell you, and I know you know from your own experience, it is absolutely worth it because the alternative is nowhere that I wanted to stay.
Right. And that's in that place of heartbreak,
Yeah.
and I do think whether you are the person who wanted the divorce or you are the person who's being divorced, if you want to put
Mhm.
it in those terms, I think there's heartbreak all around.
Absolutely.
It's, nobody goes into marriage. It's trite to say it, but it's true. Nobody goes into marriage thinking they're going to get divorced, or I
Right.
hope they don't.
Right.
But it does happen. And, the heartbreak can be, even for the person who knows that divorce is the right option, there's still heartbreak in the fact that it didn't work and
Yep.
that you are hurting someone that you care about. And, so there's so much, but we are resilient people.
Mhm.
And if we can get on the right path, having a full life, having a new life, the predominant thing I hear from divorce clients when I see them again down the road or I get back is that the divorce really was one of the best things that happened to them, whether it happened to them or they were the person who chose that, made that choice.
Yeah,
And I think that's important for people to know.
I agree.
But your exercise and your process of helping people, that whole definition of defining your values so that you can define who you are and how that works for your future is such an important exercise. And you can't start that too soon in this
Mm-mm.
process.
No, absolutely not. I mean, everyone, divorce aside, it should be something all of us are doing to intentionally create our life. And what I love about coaching is you have the opportunity to have accountability with it. Very rarely do we give ourselves an hour a week to focus on us, process what we're thinking and feeling, and how am I moving forward? What am I able to do today to move my life forward? And when we see it from that positive light and we give ourselves an hour a week to create that and to have someone who's holding us accountable, it can be life changing.
Yeah, I think that working with a coach while you're going through divorce, or I work with a business coach as I'm building out my
Yeah.
business. I do think that people have this option to find a coach that resonates for them. And there are different coaches in all different kinds of spaces.
Absolutely.
But finding someone so that you have help in doing all of this, finding your pathway, redefining your future, taking the active steps, and really importantly, what you just said about accountability,
Yep.
so important. So I urge everyone to consider reaching out for coaching help. I have a personal trainer for strength training because
Yep.
I hate strength training.
Right.
But so if that guy's not sitting there at the gym tapping his watch like it's
Hmm.
6 a.m., whereas Susan, I'm not going to go.
Right. I had a client who, when we started, I do typically 3 months or 6 months of scope of work with clients. And I had a client who, at the beginning of work, our work together, had no intentions of ever being thrown into this situation, and was faced with what's her professional impact to the world at this point. And is she going back full time, part time, not at all, volunteering? What is she doing with her time? And there was a lot of resistance there. And fast forward, at the end of our work, she had 3 full-time offers and was, thrilled to be in the space that she was in. But it takes that accountability sometimes, especially when there's resistance to the change or fear of the process. Am I going to be good enough? Am I capable? Well, I've stepped out for this long. What does that look like now? And when you have someone who is asking those deep questions, getting to the root of what's the real concern here, and how do we get you the power, the knowledge, the information you need to change that mindset, the outcome can be so, so different.
Well, I think that is the highlight to end this on, I think, for people, so that they know, that is an end result of working with coaching, right?
Yeah.
3
Hmm.
offers. I love that. That's wonderful. I wish I could say that for all my clients. So, Shannon, I think there's so much in here for people to, grasp onto and start thinking about that future and hopefully lessen that fear by taking action. I want to make sure people know how to get in touch with you.
Sure.
So, and then I think you have a special offer for listeners as well.
I do. So if you want to know more about my story and the type of coaching work that we can do together, you can visit me at lovestrengthandgrace.com. That's my website. And then I also do have a special offer for your listeners. It's actually a quick 15-minute audio that will help them understand how they can shift their thinking. I've included 4 tips that I used in my own situation and I use with my clients as well, about how to intentionally create your what's next. When that fear comes up, what are some of the small things, the quick things we can do that will create that shift for us?
Oh, well, I told you before, that's my favorite thing for my listeners is to have those concrete tips. So I urge everybody to reach out for the video. I will put all of the information in the show notes, Shannon. And, again, thank you so much for coming and helping and sharing your love, strength, and grace with my listeners.
Thanks so much for having me, Susan. It's such a pleasure. You are such a light in this space. So thank you very much for your gift.
Thank you. Thank you.